On a freezing night in March 1944, deep in the forests of Silesia, the crunch of boots on snow could be heard. Guards pacing the perimeter of Stalag Luft III had no idea, but beneath their feet, dozens of men waited to make their bid for freedom. What transpired in the coming minutes, hours and days has gone down as one of the most audacious escape attempts in history. Just 19 years later, these incredible actions were immortalised in the blockbuster film The Great Escape. But does what was shown match up to the reality of those events? Join us as, with the help of archive material, the latest technology and the words of those who were there, we answer that very question and take a deep dive into the incredible story of the real Great Escape. Despite by early 1944 the tide of war having turned decisively against Germany, for many Allied airmen captured early in the war, it was little comfort, with thousands forced to watch on in ever deteriorating conditions from behind barbed wire fences. But not everyone was content to do so. Let's zoom in and explore a key location, Stalag Luft III. Opened in March of 1942 inside a dense pine forest about 100 miles south of Berlin, it was built conveniently close to a large railway junction which still exists today, ideal for prisoner transport. Taking this fascinating Allied aerial reconnaissance photo and overlaying it exactly onto the modern map, we can travel back in time to see exactly what the camp complex looked like during the war. Australian pilot Paul Bushell, one of almost 11,000 Allied prisoners in the camp, described his surroundings. Woods completely encircled the compound, not pleasant green woods, but gaunt pines packed close together in the dry grey earth. They were everywhere you looked, monotonous barriers that shut out the world and increased the sense of godforsaken isolation. Not only was it isolated, but it was also very secure. There were 5 main compounds of prisoner barracks, each surrounded by 2 8-foot-tall barbed wire fences. The men involved in the Great Escape, and so the area of our focus, were located here in the North Camp, which contained 15 barrack huts, each holding around 100 prisoners. The southern side of the compound had a shower room, theatre and cookhouse, while on the northern side was located a coal dump, medical quarters, guard block and the infamous cooler, which, just like in the movie, contained multiple isolation cells for prisoner punishment. This aerial photograph was taken in 1944, and as we'll cover later, the West Camp was a 1943 edition, which during the initial escape planning was simply more pine forest. As we see here, at 160-yard intervals along the entire camp perimeter, watchtowers have been constructed, each equipped with searchlights and manned by armed guards. More guards patrol between those watchtowers, with the number doubled at night. On top of that, 25 or so trained guard dogs were put on the prowl. In addition, to protect against tunnelling, all huts were raised 2 feet from the loose sandy soil, which itself presented problems, and seismographic microphones were installed around the camp perimeter, always listening for the telltale signs of digging. Now let's take a look at this model of the North Camp, used as a reference for the 1963 movie set, and credit where it's due, it's pretty much spot on. We can see here the North Camp in detail, with all of its buildings, including the coal dump, the theatre, the cookhouse, alongside the medical quarters and guard block. Even the spacing between the buildings is generally accurate. And just like in the movie, there was indeed a so-called warning line, which ran around the inner side of the perimeter wire, crossing which could lead to being shot in short order. In the movie, the fictional camp commander, Colonel von Luger, was played by actor Hannes Messemer, who himself was a Wehrmacht veteran of the Eastern Front. The real commandant, Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindeiner, was also a decorated veteran, having served with distinction in the First World War. It's worth noting von Lindeiner was not a die-hard Nazi. In fact, he went out of his way to show respect to imprisoned senior officers and was determined to abide by the Geneva Convention. Nevertheless, he was just as determined to stop any escape attempts. According to American pilot Albert Clark, Lindeiner knew that our escape record could be his undoing. He operated on the assumption that if he treated us well enough, our escape efforts would diminish. He was tragically wrong. What he meant by that was that many of those who found themselves imprisoned at Stalag Luft III in 1943 had earned a reputation as determined and accomplished repeat escapers. Let's meet one in particular. This man, Roger Bushell. In the movie, his character, named Roger Bartlett, was played by Richard Attenborough, also a Second World War veteran. The real Roger Bushell, though, had been born in South Africa in 1910 before emigrating to England as a boy. He had received an excellent education, studying law at Cambridge University, and was a keen sportsman. As a wealthy and well-connected young man with a drive for adventure, Bushell joined the RAF, serving as a pilot in 601 Squadron, known as the Millionaires Mob for the wealthy backgrounds of their pilots. In May of 1940, in the skies over Dunkirk, Bushell was shot down after his first ever brush with the enemy. Picked up by German troops, he entered the system of prisoner of war camps that would become his life for the next 4 years. Sent from camp to camp, he made multiple escape attempts and eventually, after spending some time on the run in Prague, was recaptured and found himself in the maximum security Stalag Luft III. There Bushell would join Organisation X, formed by the most daring and determined prisoners, specifically to plan and carry out escapes. Just like in the movie, Bushell quickly became the organisation's leader, acquiring the name Big X. Alongside him was this man, Group Captain Herbert Massey, the camp's senior British officer. In the movie, Group Captain Ramsey was meant to represent Massey, who is depicted walking with a cane. This was accurate. Massey had actually been wounded in the same leg twice, once in each World War. And just like his fictional counterpart, he ultimately approved the plans for the Great Escape, which Bushell announced. I've decided on 3 tunnels. The Germans will probably find 1, maybe even 2. When they find one of these elaborate tunnels, they think we've put everything we've got into them. And if they find the second, they'll know damn well we have. And that's just what I want them to think. Of course, it wasn't as simple as just digging tunnels. A whole raft of considerations needed to be made to maintain the best chance of success. Bushell appointed Lieutenant Colonel Albert Clark in charge of operational security. Clark assigned men to shadow every German guarding camp, including the German investigators who occasionally roamed through the buildings. By watching these so-called ferrets and tracking their movement, the prisoners could make sure escape preparations were properly hidden. Tunnelling will be overseen by Canadian Wally Floody, a former mining engineer from Northern Ontario. Floody, seen here on the right with actor Steve McQueen, was actually hired by the filmmakers of The Great Escape as a historical consultant, and no doubt his advice was essential in getting much of the historical detail right. Tailoring and forging committees were also established, the latter of which was led by Flight Lieutenant Gilbert Tim Wallen, a former wallpaper designer. In the movie, Flight Lieutenant Colin Blythe, played by Donald Pleasance, was based on Wallen. Pleasance, like many of the other actors in the film, had also served in the Second World War. In fact, like the man he portrayed on screen, he was shot down by German fighters while serving as a radio operator in a Lancaster bomber. Pleasance, like Bushell, was imprisoned in Stalag Luft I for a time. One character in the movie who was not based on a real person was Captain Virgil Hiltz, played by Steve McQueen. While there were some Americans who assisted with the early tunnel digging, they were actually moved to a different section of the camp by the time of the escape. With most of his key appointments made, the plan began to gather pace. Let's explore those tunnels in a little detail. Famously named Tom, Dick and Harry, each was ingeniously hidden and started in a different hut aiming to pierce the camp perimeter at a pre-selected point. Tom started here, behind a stove chimney in Hut 123, and was planned to burrow about 320 feet eastwards, just past this watchtower. Dick was located beneath a drain sump via a trapdoor here in Hut 122 and was also to head eastwards. And Harry, separated from the other two, began under a stove in Hut 104 with the goal of reaching 336 feet to the tree line north of the supply road here. In this scene from the movie, we can see the entrance to Tunnel Harry, cleverly hidden under a drain sump. In reality, this was the entrance mechanism for Dick. Nevertheless, the movie does an excellent job of showing just how difficult they were to spot, including the fact that the drain could safely be covered with water. In the real Great Escape, the entrance to Harry was under the stove. The movie there accurately depicts the clever camouflage of the tile plate being lifted up when the tunnel was open. And did you notice the tin can connecting the stove exhaust in that scene? In reality, milk cans, known as clim cans, were used for a variety of ventilation and exhaust pipes. That said, not every detail of the film is perfect. While it shows brown soil as the men excavate the tunnels, this wasn't entirely the case. In this area of Silesia, the subsoil is a yellowish sand, so distinctive in fact that disposal became a major issue. That colour meant that once retrieved from homemade rail carts in the tunnel, sand dispersal had to be a covert operation. At first, prisoners would simply shovel sand into coat pockets, then slowly walk around the camp discarding it. Crude devices were soon fashioned to be hidden under clothing capable of carrying a whopping 30 pounds of sand each. Eventually, the Germans caught on, perhaps due to the distinctive waddle of the men balancing pounds of sand which had given them their prisoner nickname, penguins. While the movie did get the soil colour wrong, the penguins are actually quite accurate, including strategically dumping sand in the camp's vegetable gardens there to be raked in by waiting prisoners. In reality, a trapdoor was later built into the floor of the camp theatre, under which the sand could be dumped into the large crawl space. This was the sort of inventive ingenuity that helped Bushell's Organisation X get the tunnels built right under the noses of their German overseers. Remember the clim can in the film scene we looked at earlier? The prisoners were able to fashion the Red Cross supplied powdered milk tins into rudimentary digging tools. The tunnels were deep too, about 9 metres or 30 feet in total. But without proper ventilation, the already uncomfortable shafts could become deadly. Yet again, necessity was the mother of invention. Norwegian RAF pilot Jens Muller and British officer Bob Nelson designed a pump mechanism made with bags and wooden frames forming an accordion-style tube. The movie version is an almost exact replica of the real thing, even down to the clim can piping, an amazing example of DIY engineering. So, by May of 1943, the entrance shafts had been dug deep enough to avoid the microphones placed by the Germans, and tunnel work began day and night in shifts, with the ferrets closely watched to ensure that shift changes remained out of sight. The movie does a great job showing us what the tunnels would have looked like inside. We can see the homemade minecart system and the bedboards that helped hold up the tunnel. All of those elements were indeed real, part of the impressive excavation work done by the men. In October of 1943, there was a major setback. The Germans began to clear ground for the creation of a new prison block to the west, as we can see from the aerial photograph. Bushell decided to focus all construction on finishing Tom before the new expansion made westward tunnelling impossible. This turned out to be a mistake. The Germans, tipped off by their microphones and increased activity around Hut 123, made their move. Here's a moment in the film that isn't quite right. The film shows a German guard noticing spilled coffee as it flowed under a stove. While it's a great bit of Hollywood drama, the real discovery was a little different. At 11 a.m. on the 10th of October, a German investigator inspecting the hut found a crack in the concrete of an annex inside. When he tapped the concrete slab, it sounded strangely hollow, and upon further inspection, Tom was discovered. Oberfeldwebel Hermann Glemnitz, in charge of preventing escapes, was delighted. At the same time, the Germans marvelled at the engineering work, even documenting the tunnel's incredible construction with these fascinating images. Von Lindeiner noted that the tunnel had all the features of modern POW technology. With Tom subsequently destroyed, the Germans remaining on high alert and winter looming, the construction effort was stopped. But as 1943 ticked into 1944, Bushell decided it was time to get back to work. Dick would be converted into storage, solving part of the spoil disposal problem, whilst Harry would become the main escape route. 3 teams of men laboured long hours. Claustrophobia was an ever-present problem deep underground in dark, tight tunnels, as was collapse in the sandy soil, necessitating massive amounts of timber for shoring. Nevertheless, the men made 4 feet of progress each day. Even way stations were built into the tunnel, named after familiar London localities, Piccadilly and Leicester Square. By the 14th of March, and some 2,000 bed boards, 750 tin cans and 150 tons of sand later, Harry was finally finished and escape was a real possibility. Flight Lieutenant Flesker described Bushell's reaction. Roger stood with his arms folded across his chest, his face inscrutable, as he looked at the yawning hole at his feet. I looked at Roger and marvelled at the complete lack of visible emotion. Unfolding below him was the culmination of his dream, tangible evidence of his genius. Almost an extension of himself, the door to freedom was at that moment being unlocked by him. While the construction was being finished, the final preparations for the escapers were well underway. But who was actually selected to go, and why? The escape planners decided that the smartest choice would be to choose escapees based on likelihood of success. Fluency in German or other European languages was considered the most valuable trait for an escapee. A list was drawn up, with the first escapees being those deemed most likely to score a home run by making it out of Nazi-occupied Europe. But what would they wear? Thanks to black market deals and a fair amount of scrounging, a menagerie of German badges, buckles, buttons and bits of civilian clothing had been procured. Organisation X appointed teams to get creative with extra fabric sourced from prisoner clothing, any camp material and Red Cross bags. These disguises were rudimentary at best, but nevertheless an impressive closet was assembled. 12 German military uniforms, 200 civilian jackets, 200 pairs of trousers, 40 overcoats, 100 suits and 250 caps, one for each of those selected to escape. A soot and oil mixture made a suitable ink for the forgers, who produced a stunning 350 documents, including foreign worker identity cards made with official stamps fashioned from the rubber of prisoners' boots. Based on smuggled originals and photos of documents, these were handwritten in great detail. Accuracy was a concern though, because although these documents were painstakingly made, they weren't perfect. One POW noted that it might have passed a perfunctory examination but would not have deceived anybody of authority. That was going to be a problem. Friday, March the 24th, 1944 started like every other day in Stalag Luft III, with roll call. Frank Waddington recalled that morning. I remember as this German went down the row counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I thought, the next time you count us, mate, you're going to have a shock. As the men ate as much as their stomachs could hold, they thought about what was about to unfold. Ken Rees recalled that the tension was stomach-churning, almost worse than before any operation I could remember. Nevertheless, every man had his personal escape plan ready. The first step for most was reaching Saarbrücken train station and then finding different ways out of occupied Europe, mostly via Spain or Scandinavia. Bushell's plan was to make his way to Saarbrücken and there cross into France, where he hoped to link up with the French resistance. Let's take a look at the key moment of the classic film, the escape. Is it accurate as to what actually took place? First, did Tunnel Harry really exit out into the open rather than into the trees? German investigation photos clearly show tree roots emerging from the ceiling of the tunnel. One German guard also testified that the tunnel's exit was in the woods, about 10 metres from the road on the outside of the north compound. But that's not the whole story. Using the exact location of that north chimney here and the exact exit point here, we can visualise the tunnel from above. Almost all of the men who took part that day said that the tunnel exit was 10 to 20 feet from the tree line at least. We do know that the prisoner's measurement from Hut 104's north chimney to the exit was about 344 feet, and the exit was about 50 feet past a guard tower. We can also see that there was cleared ground on the north side of the road, meaning that the tunnel would have to stretch even further to reach the actual tree line. We also know that stumps were commonplace throughout the camp, inside and out, and it's likely the tree roots seen here in some of these photos are actually just those of already felled trees. On balance, it is probably true that the tunnel didn't quite reach the tree line, likely due to simple miscalculation. After all, the tunnellers couldn't exactly walk along the surface with a tape measure. The movie also correctly shows the German guards and searchlights looking inwards towards the camp rather than out towards the perimeter. This is accurate, and it was an important factor for the men making the dash from the tunnel to the trees. Furthermore, the movie correctly depicts the lookouts who tugged on a rope connected to the tunnel when the German guards were approaching. The air raid shown in the movie Escape is also historically accurate. The tunnel lights, stolen from a visiting work party, had been plugged into the camp power supply, which was shut down during air raids to enforce a blackout. This made men crawling through the constrained tunnel even slower, as they were moving in essentially complete darkness. But unlike in the movie, the actual escape took place over snow-covered ground, not green grass. In fact, it was actually quite cold, and the frozen ground caused considerable delay in breaking through to the surface. Nevertheless, from about 10:30 p.m, man after man emerged from the earth into the cold, moonless night and made their way north through this forest towards Saarbrücken train station. It would have only been about 600 yards from the tunnel exit to the station, though snow and forest would have slowed the escapees down considerably. At about 5 a.m, men were still emerging when it all went wrong. A German guard noticed the vapour steaming off the hot tunnel exit into the cold winter air. Realising what he had found, he raised his rifle. Squadron leader Lawrence Revel Carter, who had just left the tunnel and entered the woodline, shouted, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" But it was too late. The guard fired a shot into the air as the men in the woodline sprinted away at full speed. Back in Hut 104, chaos erupted. Men burned their fake documents and hid as much evidence as they could, whilst others tried to slip away back to their own huts. As the guards' whistles blew and soldiers came running, the game was up. For those in the camp, the Great Escape was over. By 7 a.m, an alert was issued. The alarm rippled across Germany and occupied Europe as government offices received warnings about escapees on the loose. For the 76 men who had managed to escape, the chase was on. Once Bushell and his fellow POWs took their first free steps in years, every single German in uniform across the entire Third Reich would be hunting them. Bushell himself was fourth to escape, dressed in a pinstripe suit intended to make him look like a French businessman. At his side was Free French RAF pilot Bernhard Scheidauer, fluent in German, French and English. The two planned to reach the French border by train and there meet up with the local resistance and cross over the Pyrenees into Spain. First though, the two men have fled through these woods towards Sargen station on foot, making it here by about 11 PM. Then they used the precious few Reichsmarks that X-Organisation had collected to buy tickets. Their train trip to the French border, some 550 miles away, though wasn't direct. In fact, it was extremely complicated. They first took a train to Breslau before switching and heading to Frankfurt. There they boarded their final train to Saarbrücken on the French border. That was where Bushell's luck ran out. Just before reaching Saarbrücken, the two were stopped by a police officer checking documents. Despite the best efforts of Organisation X's forgers, the officer quickly noticed something didn't seem quite right with their documents, and at 2:30 that afternoon the two men were arrested, some 500 miles from Stalag Luft III and only 3 miles from the French border. The going wasn't easy for the rest of the escapees either. Other men also made it quite a way, some as far as the French border and the northern German port cities. Many others didn't even make it out of the region. 6 men were captured in Hirschberg alone, having made it just a few train stops away from the camp. Some missed their trains or couldn't find the station and ended up attempting escape on foot in the brutal cold. Many were captured after having their papers inspected, or going into towns and villages on foot in search of supplies. Here the film doesn't quite stack up with the true story. And while 3 men did successfully escape Nazi-occupied Europe, it wasn't the 3 men in the movie. Those home runs were by Norwegians Per Bergsland and Jens Müller, who successfully made it to Sweden via train and boat, and Dutchman Bran van der Stok, who managed to use his language skills to get to France, where the resistance smuggled him to neutral Spain. Ultimately, of the 76 men, hailing from 13 separate countries, who had managed to escape Stalag Luft III, 73 were recaptured, most within 24 hours. But despite that very limited success, the event sent shockwaves through German high command, and particularly enraged Hitler, who was determined to make an example of the men who had broken out of a seemingly unescapable camp. Roger Bushell and Bernhard Scheidauer were amongst them. Originally held here at Lerchesfleur prison in Saarbrücken, they were eventually moved to the local Gestapo headquarters, from where, early on the 29th of March, and under the pretense of being returned to a POW camp, the 2 handcuffed men, along with 3 Gestapo officers, set off eastwards out of town. Around 2 hours later, and somewhere along this road, about 3 miles east of Kaiserslautern, the car came to an abrupt stop. Here the 2 officers were released from their manacles and told they could relieve themselves before they continued onwards to camp. As they did so, a pair of shots rang out, and within moments both were dead. Tragically, they were not alone. All told, 50 of the 76 Great Escapers, on orders of Hitler and the Reichshead Security Office in Berlin, were executed over the course of several weeks, in brutal reprisals which led to an extensive post-war investigation. Eventually, 18 men would face trial and 13 of the perpetrators would pay for their crimes with their lives. Today, the cremated remains of 48 of the victims are buried right here in a beautifully maintained Commonwealth War Graves plot in Poznan Old Garrison Cemetery in Poland. Amongst them is squadron leader Roger Bushell, the man who led the Great Escape. The story of those courageous officers, though, didn't end in 1944. Instead, almost 2 decades later, it was given new life with the release of one of the best-known films in modern cinematic history. So, was The Great Escape a success? Despite the tragic end, perhaps in one sense it was. For Bushell and the other POWs who participated, the effort was an attempt to wrest back control of their lives. It was a search for a moment of freedom in which the captured men could control their own destinies once again. In the process, their Great Escape became the Great Escape, a legacy that endures to this day. Thanks for watching. If, like us, you find the Second World War endlessly fascinating, why not check out our dedicated podcast, World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, where each week our historians, Jesse Alexander and Professor Matthias Strohn, explore famous episodes from throughout the conflict from both the Allied and Axis perspectives. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.